Have you ever walked away from a completely normal conversation, and hours later your mind is still replaying it? The tone of their voice, the moment you hesitated, the thing you wish you had said differently. If that happens to you, it might feel like overthinking. But psychology suggests this habit may actually reveal something very specific about how your brain processes social experiences. If your mind tends to replay conversations like this, you may have wondered something quietly to yourself. Why can't I just let things go? Maybe you've watched other people finish a conversation, laugh, and move on with their day, while your mind keeps circling back, replaying the tone, the pauses, the tiny details that suddenly seem more important later. And after a while, it can start to feel frustrating. You might even wonder if you're just overthinking too much. But here's something important to understand. This pattern is far more common than most people realize. Many people who replay conversations in their head aren't doing it because they're socially awkward or overly anxious. They're doing it because their brain naturally processes social experiences more deeply. While some people move quickly from one moment to the next, your mind tends to slow down and examine what just happened. Not just the words that were spoken, but the meaning behind them, the emotional tone, the subtle signals most people barely notice in the moment. So if you've ever found yourself lying in bed later that night, replaying a conversation from earlier in the day, you're not strange for doing that. Your brain may simply be trying to understand the interaction more completely. And once you understand how this works psychologically, something interesting starts to appear. Because this habit of replaying conversations usually comes from a few very specific ways the brain processes social information. From a psychological perspective, this experience is often connected to something researchers call post-event processing. It simply means that after a social interaction ends, the brain continues thinking about it for a while. Almost like your mind presses replay. Psychologists have noticed that some people naturally do this more than others. Not because something is wrong with them, but because their brains are trying to analyze social information more carefully. In psychology, this pattern is often linked to something called post-event processing, a mental habit where the brain reviews social interactions to understand them more clearly. Think of it like this. Imagine two people leaving the same conversation. For one person, the moment ends and their attention quickly moves to the next thing. Dinner, a message on their phone, something happening around them. But for the other person, the brain quietly keeps working in the background, reviewing the interaction, noticing the tone of someone's voice, replaying a sentence to understand what it really meant, sometimes even wondering if there was something hidden between the lines. Neuroscience suggests that this kind of mental replay is connected to systems in the brain responsible for social awareness, emotional processing, and pattern recognition. In simple terms, your brain is trying to understand people. It's looking for meaning, for emotional signals, for patterns in how others communicate. And while that process can sometimes feel like overthinking, it's actually part of how some minds learn from social experiences. But here's where things start to get interesting, because replaying conversations usually isn't caused by just one psychological trait. In fact, there are several different mental patterns that can make someone more likely to revisit conversations in their head. So what exactly is happening inside the mind of someone who keeps replaying conversations? Psychology suggests that this habit often comes from a few very specific ways the brain processes social experiences. And once you see these patterns, many of those late-night mental replays start to make a lot more sense. The first pattern is something we could call social pattern recognition. Some people naturally look for patterns in human behavior. Your brain doesn't just hear words in a conversation. It quietly tracks tone, pauses, facial expressions, and the emotional atmosphere in the room. At the moment, everything may seem completely normal, but later your mind starts connecting the dots. You suddenly remember the way someone paused before answering, or how their voice changed slightly when a certain topic came up. And without trying to, your brain begins asking questions. Did that moment mean something? Was there something deeper behind that reaction? For people with strong social pattern recognition, the brain naturally revisits conversations because it's still processing the signals. And interestingly, this same ability is often what allows someone to become very good at reading people over time. But that's only one layer of the story. because replaying conversations isn't always about analyzing others. Sometimes it comes from something happening inside your emotional world. The second pattern is emotional processing depth. Some minds experience emotions more intensely and take longer to fully process them. When a conversation carries emotional meaning, even subtle meaning, your brain doesn't just register it and move on. It keeps turning it over gently, trying to understand it completely. Maybe someone made a small comment that stayed with you. Or maybe there was a moment in the conversation that felt slightly uncomfortable, even if nothing dramatic happened. Hours later, your mind brings it back. Not because you're obsessed with it, but because your brain is still trying to understand the emotional context of that moment. People who process emotions deeply often notice things that others overlook. A slight tension in someone's voice, a feeling that something was left unsaid. And while this sensitivity can sometimes make conversations linger in your mind longer than you'd like, it's also closely connected to empathy and emotional intelligence. But here's something many people misunderstand about this habit. Sometimes replaying conversations isn't about the other person at all. It's actually about your own desire to communicate clearly. But there's another reason some people replay conversations that most psychology discussions completely overlook. The third pattern is the drive for social accuracy. Some people have a strong internal instinct to make sure they express themselves honestly and clearly in conversations. Your mind values meaningful communication. So after a conversation ends, your brain may quietly review what happened. Not to criticize yourself, but to check whether your thoughts were understood the way you intended. You might suddenly think, maybe I could have explained that better, or I hope they didn't misunderstand what I meant. This kind of reflection often comes from people who care deeply about authenticity in relationships. They want conversations to feel real, clear, respectful, and when communication matters to you at that level, your brain naturally becomes more reflective afterward. Interestingly, many people who replay conversations also tend to score higher in something psychologists call self-reflective awareness, the ability to examine their own thoughts and behavior. In other words, the same habit that sometimes feels like overthinking is often connected to a deeper form of self-awareness. By now, you might recognize pieces of yourself in one or even all of these patterns. But here's where things take an interesting turn. Because most people assume that replaying conversations is simply a form of overthinking, something the brain does when it's stuck. But the truth is a little more surprising than that. But here's the part most people never consider. What if replaying conversations isn't your brain getting stuck? What if it's actually your brain trying to learn? Think about it for a moment. When your mind revisits a conversation, it's not just repeating the past. It's quietly exploring possibilities. What did that moment really mean? How could I respond differently next time? Was there something important hidden in that interaction? In a way, your mind is running small social simulations, testing ideas, rehearsing better responses, trying to understand people a little more clearly. And once you start looking at it this way, replaying conversations doesn't seem like pointless overthinking anymore. It starts to look more like a form of deep reflection. And that reflection can reveal something surprisingly powerful about how your mind actually works. When people talk about replaying conversations in their head, it's usually framed as a weakness. They call it overthinking, something you're supposed to stop doing, something that means you're too sensitive, too self-critical, or too caught up in the past. But psychology often sees it a little differently, because what looks like overthinking on the surface can actually be a form of reflective thinking. Your brain isn't just repeating the moment, it's learning from it. Every time your mind revisits a conversation, it's quietly asking questions. What did that person really mean? What was I feeling in that moment? What could I understand better next time? It's a process of slowly refining your understanding of people, almost like your mind is building a more detailed map of human behavior. Some people move through social experiences quickly. They experience a moment once, and that's the end of it. But reflective thinkers experience interactions twice. Once in the moment, and once again during reflection. And during that second pass, the brain often notices things it didn't catch the first time. A subtle emotional shift, a hidden meaning, a better way to express something next time. Over time, this kind of reflection can develop into something powerful. Greater self-awareness, stronger emotional intelligence, a deeper ability to understand how people feel and why they behave the way they do. In other words, the same mind that sometimes replays conversations late at night is often the same mind that becomes deeply perceptive about human relationships. So what feels like a flaw in the moment may actually be part of a much bigger strength. A mind that doesn't just experience interactions on the surface, but slowly learns from them layer by layer. And once you start to see it that way, those quiet moments of reflection begin to look very different. Because they might be revealing something important about the way your mind understands the world. So if you've ever found yourself lying in bed at night, and a conversation from earlier in the day suddenly comes back to your mind, the tone of someone's voice, a sentence you keep replaying, a moment that seemed small at the time, but now feels strangely important, can feel frustrating. You might even wish your mind would just switch off and move on like everyone else seems to. But maybe the reason your brain revisits these moments isn't because something is wrong with you. Maybe it's because your mind is built to notice depth. You notice emotional shifts. You notice meaning behind words. You notice the small details in human interactions that many people never stop to think about. And sometimes that awareness makes your inner world a little louder, a little more reflective. But it's also the same quality that allows you to understand people more deeply, to feel empathy more strongly, to recognize the subtle things that make relationships meaningful. So if you replay conversations in your head from time to time, you're not strange for that. You're not broken. Your mind simply doesn't rush past human experiences, pauses, reflects, and tries to understand them. And in a world that often moves too fast to notice those quiet layers of human connection, that kind of mind is actually something very rare. If some part of this video felt a little too familiar, there's a good chance you're someone who naturally thinks deeply about people, emotions, and the meaning behind everyday moments. And if that sounds like you, you're definitely not alone here. This channel is a place for people who like to slow down and understand the hidden psychology behind how our minds work, especially the quiet patterns most people never talk about. So if these ideas resonate with the way you experience the world, you're always welcome to stay and explore more with us. And I'm curious about something. Do you ever catch yourself replaying a specific moment from a conversation later on? Maybe something someone said, or something you wish you had said differently. If you feel comfortable, share it in the comments. Sometimes just realizing that other people experience the same thing can feel surprisingly comforting.